Have you ever stopped to think about what happened to the soldiers who managed to cross the MG42's field of death on Omaha Beach and lived to tell the tale? Have you ever stopped to think about what was going through the minds of the German soldiers behind the most feared machine gun of World War II? The MG42, the sound that froze men's blood even before they reached the shore. Now, imagine being there, inside a cold and narrow bunker, watching the sea turn into a living wall of enemy vessels, knowing that every move you make could be your last. That's who we're talking about today, the men who held Hitler's Buzzsaw on Omaha Beach. And stick with me until the end, because you're going to discover what happened to these gunners after the deafening sound stopped and the silence of surrender began. In early 1944, while the Allies prepared to cross the English Channel, the Germans reinforced the defenses of the so-called Atlantic Wall. Every stretch of coast was studied, every vulnerable point turned into a concrete fortress. And within those fortifications were the young men responsible for one of the deadliest weapons ever created, the MG42. Its fire was so rapid that individual shots weren't heard, but a continuous sequence, like a blade slicing through the air. It was a machine designed to dominate fear, the enemies and the operators. The noise was more than sound, it was pure psychology, an attempt to paralyze before killing. Each resistance nest, called Widerstandsnest, was positioned strategically so that one bunker protected another. In Omaha, these points formed a deadly web. Anyone trying to escape the fire of one fell into the line of sight of the next. Inside them, the gunners and their assistants prepared for what they knew was inevitable. The orders were clear: hold the position at any cost. For many, any cost meant dying right there between concrete walls and smoke. Few of these men imagined that the same sound that inspired so much fear would also turn them into priority targets. Meanwhile, on the other side of the channel, the Allies planned a surgical precision operation. The maps showed every enemy nest, every weapon, every line of defense. The initial bombardment was supposed to destroy everything, a storm of steel that on paper seemed sufficient to guarantee the invasion's success. But war rarely follows the plan. When the sun began to rise on June 6, 1944, the fire from Allied ships fell on the Normandy cliffs. The explosions shook the ground, and the air seemed to vibrate. But when the smoke cleared, many bunkers remained intact. Inside them, the gunners were still breathing, frightened but alive. The tension in that moment was almost physical. In each fortification, men gripped their weapons and stared at the sea. What they saw was something they would never forget. The horizon covered by hundreds of vessels, as if the ocean itself was coming toward them. Some prayed, others stayed silent, trying to steady their trembling hands. And when the engines began to roar and the first vessels approached, fear gave way to instinct. Finger on the trigger, eyes fixed on the waves. It was the beginning of the largest landing in history, and also the beginning of the end for many who are behind the MG42. The noise of the propellers, the sound of shots fired into the void, and then the first burst. The MG42 began to sing, and with it, hell took shape. What the Allies would later call the longest day had begun, and there, in that instant, the German gunners became something more than soldiers. They became part of the very sound of war. But what happened after the first shot echoed? How did these men face the relentless advance of thousands of soldiers and the weight of their own conscience? In the next few minutes, you're going to see what really went on behind the concrete walls on Omaha Beach, where fear, obedience, and survival blended into a single sound, the sound of the MG42.
The dawn of June 6, 1944, revealed a scene that seemed impossible to stop. Allied vessels covered the horizon like a swarm of steel and men. advancing slowly under the deafening sound of engines and the distant roar of warships. Inside the bunkers, the MG42 gunners watched in silence, waiting for the command to open fire. The tension was unbearable, the sound of breathing mixed with the creak of metal and the growing heat of the gun barrel. In a few seconds, the sea ahead of them would become a shooting gallery. And when the first landing ramp dropped, hell opened up. The bursts began with methodical precision. The MG42 spat fire in short, deadly intervals, cutting through sand and water like a high-speed blade. The sound was continuous, almost mechanical, a frenzied buzz that made the air itself vibrate. Every time the trigger was pressed, dozens of soldiers fell before they could take their first step. The Allies advanced, but every meter gained cost blood. The bunkers, designed to withstand direct hits, seemed indestructible. Inside them, the Germans swapped overheated barrels, shouted instructions, reloaded ammunition belts with trembling hands. The sand on the floor was already covered with spent casings, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with smoke and sweat. Outside, chaos was absolute. The waves brought debris, bodies, and screams. Communications were lost, and officers shouted orders that no one heard. American amphibious tanks, which were supposed to provide support, sank before reaching the beach. Those that made it were easy targets, set ablaze before they could fire. Still, men kept advancing, crawling through craters and metal obstacles. Fear didn't stop them. It was desperation that kept them going. They knew that staying still meant death. From inside the bunker, the gunners saw the enemy approaching faster than expected. The MG42, though lethal, couldn't stop the entire sea. Every minute, the number of targets increased. The barrel's heat made the gun hiss. Swapping the barrel was a risk, seconds of vulnerability that could cost lives, and many paid that price. One by one, the bunkers began to lose their assistance, hit by grenade fragments and precision shots. Still, the gunners continued, not for glory, but by reflex. Training, doctrine, and fear merged into a single motion: hold the trigger. But the power of that weapon also became its curse. The Allies could identify the sound of an MG42 from miles away, and every time one of those machine guns roared, it became the primary target. Ships redirected fire, and American artillerymen adjusted their aim to silence those positions. Inside the fortifications, chunks of concrete flew, and the ground shook with each impact. Even so, many gunners refused to abandon their posts. They knew that if they tried to flee, they would be killed by their own troops or crushed by the bombardment. Among them were veterans who had already fought in Russia, and young men who had never heard a real shot fired. Some were Germans, others foreigners forced to fight for the Reich. But in that moment, all were united by the same fate: hold the enemy long enough. Every second of resistance meant more minutes for reinforcements to arrive, or at least for Germany to believe it still had a chance. And outside, the Allies didn't give up. Small groups began to reorganize, using any hole in the sand as shelter. As the hours passed, some managed to reach the slopes and flank the German positions. The sound of the MG42s, once dominant, began to mix with nearby explosions and the crack of grenades being thrown at the bunker openings. Gradually, the sonic dominance of the MG42 was replaced by something new: the sound of approach. Footsteps, shouts in English, the metallic clatter of weapons being reloaded nearby. Inside the fortifications, the gunners realized the battle was shifting direction. What had started as superiority now turned to desperation. And in that instant, between the echo of the last bursts, the question no one wanted to ask began to form in every soldier's mind. What would happen when the enemy was too close to shoot? In the next few minutes, you're going to see what happens when war stops being a fight between armies and turns into a battle for survival inside a bunker surrounded, where every breath could be the last, and silence is worth more than any shot.
Time seemed to distort inside the bunkers. Every second, the sound of combat drew closer,
until there was no difference between the roar of the machine guns and the screams outside. The air was hot, heavy, unbreathable. Ammunition, once abundant, began to run low. The MG42 barrel glowed red, warped by the heat. The gunners exchanged quick glances that said what no one had the courage to speak: the end was near. One of them, a boy of just 19, looked at the crumpled photograph pinned to the wall. It was of his mother, holding a small child. He closed his eyes for a moment, heard the noise of approaching boots, and gripped the weapon again. There was nowhere to run. The sound of the Allies echoed through the concrete passages. Orders, shots, hurried footsteps. And then, a different sound, the dry crack of a grenade being thrown. It bounced once, twice, and exploded, sending shrapnel and smoke everywhere. Outside, small groups of American soldiers moved between craters, debris, and bodies. They knew every bunker hid a machine gun still active, ready to open fire at any second. Officers shouted orders for coordinated attacks, but in practice, the advance was improvised. It was hand-to-hand war. One mistake, one wrong move, and the result was fatal. Some soldiers advanced with flamethrowers, others with improvised explosives, all with the same goal: silence the sound that had dominated the dawn since dawn. Inside the bunker, the air was thick with smoke and dust. The noise of grenades made the ceiling shudder. One gunner tried to reload, but his hands shook so much that the ammunition belt fell before reaching the feeder. Another, wounded, held his injury with one hand and the trigger with the other, firing blindly. The instinct for survival overrode any training. They weren't fighting for Hitler anymore, nor for Germany. They were fighting for the next minute of life. The Allies approached quickly. A group of Rangers positioned themselves behind a twisted metal structure, preparing a direct assault. One of them, a veteran sergeant, took a deep breath and said to his men, "Wait for the reload. When the sound stops, run." And that's what they did. The momentary silence of the MG42, just 5 seconds, was the signal. They advanced with full force, throwing grenades and direct fire at the bunker's slits. The impact was devastating. Screams, smoke, shrapnel. When the dust settled, the few German survivors were wounded, disarmed, and in shock. On the American side, adrenaline replaced fear. They knew that behind every fortification were men responsible for hundreds of deaths in the last hours. And in that state of fury and exhaustion, surrender wasn't always accepted. Many bunkers were taken by force, and gunners who tried to surrender found only silence, the kind of silence that war imposes without needing orders. But some were spared. One of these survivors would later be identified as Heinrich Salo, the young gunner who fought at WN62 and fired nearly 12,000 rounds that day. He saw the sea covered in smoke and men and believed he would never leave there alive. When the ammunition ran out, he fled through the fields, hiding in craters and hedgerows until he was captured. The American soldiers who took him prisoner never knew who he was. He omitted that he had been an MG42 gunner. And in that moment, with the weapons silenced and the beach covered in bodies, the sound that had dominated the dawn finally disappeared. In its place, the wind brought something heavier than the noise itself. Silence. The silence of those who survived and the distant echo of what the war had made of both sides, victims and executioners at the same time. Before we continue, a quick pause. If you're passionate about real history and want to understand the human side behind the great events of World War II, subscribe to the channel right now. Here, every episode reveals what history books leave in the margins, the fear, the morals, and the decisions that shaped the fate of millions. In the next few minutes, you're going to discover what really happened to the gunners who surrendered, and why, for many of them, survival was just the beginning of another kind of condemnation.
When the fire ceased and the echo of the machine guns faded, a new sound began to dominate the Normandy beaches, the murmur of the survivors. The wind carried the crackle of flames, the moans of the wounded, and the metallic sound of shovels beginning to dig the first improvised trenches. D-Day was far from over, but German resistance at Omaha was beginning to crumble. In the bunkers, the few who remained alive, wounded, deaf, and covered in dust, knew the war had changed. That bunker, once a symbol of impenetrable defense, was now a prison. Surrender, however, was not simple. For many gunners, it meant entering a limbo between life and death. On the Allied side,
The anger was as palpable as the smoke still hanging over the beach. The American soldiers, exhausted and traumatized, saw the men behind the MG42s as directly responsible for the hundreds of fallen comrades. And although the laws of war demanded that prisoners be treated humanely, on that stretch of sand, it didn't always happen. There are reports, silent ones, omitted from official accounts, of gunners who were killed right after raising their hands. Hatred, pain, and the instinct for revenge replaced discipline. Others, however, had different fates. They were captured, disarmed, and escorted to improvised assembly points. Many were wounded, others in shock, unable to speak. The blank stare, the trembling hands, marks of those who had spent hours in an endless cycle of firing and hearing screams. Some of these men, still young, barely understood what they had done. They had obeyed orders, fulfilled duties, and now, disarmed, they became living witnesses to something no one wanted to remember. The treatment of prisoners varied depending on who found them. Some Allied officers insisted on following the rules of war, ensuring shelter and first aid. Others simply turned away, leaving the wounded to agonize until medical teams arrived. For the gunners who survived, the prisoner camp meant no relief. It was just another kind of captivity. There, memories were the real enemy. Many would spend years trying to forget the sound of the MG42. Few would succeed. But the story doesn't end on the beaches. When news of the invasion reached Berlin, German propaganda tried to turn tragedy into heroism. The gunners who resisted for hours were called patriots, defenders of the Reich, martyrs of the Atlantic. The reality, however, was very different. Most of these young men never believed in heroism. They believed only in survival. In the camps, far from home, they exchanged memories of Omaha, like talking about a nightmare. The sound of the machine guns, the smell of smoke, the exact moment they realized they were alone. Years later, many of these men returned to their cities, trying to restart a life that no longer belonged to them. Among them was Henrik Sau, who spent months in captivity before being released. He never forgot the day the sea turned into a field of the dead. For decades, he kept silent, avoiding talking about what he lived through. The weight of the memory followed him like a constant echo, the same sound that once echoed from the cliffs of Omaha. And it's here that the narrative changes tone. The war was over, but the sound of the MG42 continued to haunt them. The trauma didn't end with the ceasing of weapons. Many of these veterans lived tormented by guilt, not just for those they killed, but for those they couldn't save. At veterans gatherings, some avoided looking former enemies in the eye. Others, over time, sought something they never imagined finding: reconciliation. It's at this point that Henrik Sau's story takes on another meaning. Decades after D-Day, he reconnected with the man he had wounded at Omaha, the American soldier David Silva. The two sat face to face, without uniforms, without weapons, just with the weight of the past between them. The meeting was silent. Neither asked for apologies, and neither expected forgiveness. But in that instant, the sound of the MG42, the same sound that once separated them, finally fell silent. And if you've made it this far, you're about to understand something few documentaries show. The real battlefield begins when silence arrives. In the next few minutes, we'll return to those beaches, not to talk about strategies or victories, but to understand the echo the war left in these men's minds, and why, even decades later, the sound of the MG42 still resonates in the memories of those who survived.
Decades have passed, but on the cliffs of Normandy, the wind still carries stories that time tried to erase. The rusted iron of weapons, the concrete ruins, the holes in the walls, everything remains like open scars. And among these remnants echoes a sound that only those who were there can hear, the sound of fear. Because the sound of the MG42 was not just the noise of a weapon, it was the sound of a moment when the entire world seemed on the brink of the abyss. Historians call it the perfect machine of destruction,
Survivors called it the voice of hell. And the truth is that for both sides, the sound of the MG42 became a symbol of something greater than the war itself. A reminder of how far humanity can go when obedience mixes with terror. The soldiers who operated it, even years later, described the experience as mechanical. They didn't remember faces, just shadows moving under the sights, and the instinct that said, "Keep firing." It was the reflex of a generation trained to obey before thinking, and that only much later understood the weight of every shot. In the archives of World War II, there are cold, objective records about these weapons, rate of fire, range, efficiency, but there is no record of what came after. There are no statistics to measure the silence that remained. Many gunners spent the rest of their lives trying to reconstruct the meaning of what they did. Some returned to farms, others became workers or teachers, but all carried the same ghost, the sound that wouldn't let them sleep. Interviews recorded decades later revealed trembling voices, long pauses, contained tears. None of them spoke of the war with pride, only with a silent pain, the pain of those who survived something that should never have existed. The reunion between former enemies, like that of Heinrich Sau and David Silva, is a rare symbol of reconciliation. Two men who, on opposite sides of the machine gun, saw the same hell, now shared a table and the same weight on their souls. Sau didn't apologize, and Silva didn't demand it. They just sat in silence, as if they understood there were no words that could undo the past. For them, the war was over, but the memory never ceased. That conversation wasn't about forgiveness, but about survival, about the need to look back and see that there was still humanity after it all. Today, on the beaches of Omaha, tourists walk among the preserved bunkers. Some take photos, others leave flowers. Few realize they're treading one of the most intense places in modern history, where sound and silence met. The sound of the MG42 is still used in historical reenactments, films, and even military training as an example of firepower. But for those who lived that day, it's more than a sound. It's the symbol of a collective trauma. And when the wind blows through the bunker slits, the low rumble that echoes isn't just the waves crashing. It's the distant echo of a past that refuses to disappear. And it's here that the video finds its endpoint. Not in glory, not in victory, but in the echo. Because wars end in books, but continue inside those who survive. Weapons fall silent, but memories remain. And the sound of the MG42, that metallic buzz that once made the world tremble, still resonates in humanity's conscience, reminding us that the price of blind obedience is always higher than any victory. Before we end, if you believe history shouldn't be told only by the victors, but also by those who lived the forgotten side of the war, subscribe now. Here, every video reveals what books don't tell, the silenced voices, the human decisions, and the echoes that time couldn't erase, because understanding war is the first step to never repeating it. And when the video ends, the final sound isn't the MG42 firing. It's silence. The same silence that came after the last shot, when the world realized what it had done. A heavy, eternal silence, and necessary.
The silence left after the war was not just the sound of the end of combat. It was the weight of a world trying to understand what had happened. The survivors, both Allied and German, returned home with whole bodies but fractured souls. Many didn't talk about what they saw. Others, when they tried, got lost in fragmented memories, full of guilt, fear, and relief. The sound of the MG42, that sharp and unmistakable noise, was no longer heard on the battlefields, but continued alive inside the heads that survived it. It was the constant echo of a war that refused to be forgotten. Decades later,
Documentaries, books, and films would try to recreate that sound, the inhuman buzz that dominated the Normandy beaches. But according to the veterans, no recording came close. The real sound, they said, was something the body felt, not just heard. A metallic roar that pierced bones, paralyzed the heart, and stopped time. It was the sound of mechanized death. And understanding that is understanding what D-Day really was. Not an event of victory and glory, but a moment when humanity confronted its own brutality. The MG42 gunners, in turn, faded away one by one. Many died without telling their story, carrying with them the burden of having been both victims and instruments of destruction. Those who spoke did so with a sad coldness, describing what they felt not with emotion, but with an almost philosophical resignation. They knew that in war, right and wrong mix too quickly. What starts as duty turns into survival. And in the end, everyone loses something they can never recover: inner peace. That's why, even today, walking on Omaha Beach isn't just visiting a historical site. It's walking on the boundary between past and memory. Every stone, every crater, every twisted piece of metal tells part of this story. The sand hides what remains, and the wind tells the rest. Sometimes, when the sea is calm, the sound of the waves seems to carry a distant rhythm, an almost imperceptible metallic echo. It's the same sound that echoed in 1944, the sound of the MG42, now transformed into memory. The story of these men, those who fired and those who advanced, is the rawest portrait of what war does to those who take part in it. None of them emerged victorious. None of them emerged the same. And that's why their voices still matter, because each one reminds us that war never ends when the shots stop. It continues in silence, inside those who survived. And if you've made it this far, it's because you believe history isn't just about dates, names, and battles. It's about people. It's about what we feel when we look at the past and recognize how much humanity is capable of building and destroying. That's why subscribe to the channel right now, because here, history is told without filters, without invented heroes, and without ready-made narratives. Here, the focus is what really matters, the human truth behind the events that change the world. In the next episodes, we'll continue exploring stories that time tried to bury, forgotten battles, anonymous heroes, and moments when humanity teetered on the brink of collapse. Because in the end, understanding the past is the only way not to repeat it. And as long as there's someone willing to listen, the voices of Omaha, of the Normandy cliffs, and of the gunners who once held the MG42 will remain alive, like a reminder that history, no matter how silent it seems, never stops speaking.